pregnant when Fukushima happened, and our child was born 2 months later. And I worry about him all the time. So just to imagine what the mothers in Fukushima must be going through is just... So I talked to you guys, we're kind of changing gears now from the nuclear power issues and whistleblowers to nuclear weapons. Livermore Lab is a nuclear weapons lab. 8% of the budget there is still devoted to nuclear weapons activities today. So that's about $1 billion a year that goes to nuclear weapons activities. They still have radioactive material on site, although less than they used to. But I think what goes kind of unacknowledged is the major impact the work there had on the workers. It's had a big impact on the community, and we kind of use that and refer to that a lot. We don't really refer to the workers. So I'm going to talk to you guys mainly about the workers today. But in case you aren't very familiar with Livermore, I'll talk a little bit about the lab itself and its history, talk about a program that the government has set up to compensate the workers, and all about whistleblowing in the nuclear weapons complex more generally. Just share some stories that I have from workers that I think you might think are interesting. So Livermore Lab was set up in 1953, opened in 1953, as one of our two nuclear labs, the other being Los Alamos, which developed the bombs that bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When it opened, they were opening it really to compete with the weapons programs Alamos in order to push forward more nuclear weapons in hope of thermonuclear weapons, which is going to cost them. The waste treatment plant will turn this waste into glass, vitrify it, and then that can be more safely disposed of. Liquid waste is much more difficult to deal with. A solid waste would be. Good thing that we're building this plant. Bechtel Corporation, headquartered here in San Francisco, is the corporation that contracted to build it, and they aimed to be cutting corners. Big surprise. And some of the ways they were cutting corners started to alarm workers. A engineer who for Bechtel for 30 years, a top-level engineer, looked at what they were doing, looked at some of the design changes they were after the designs had been approved, and setting the facility at risk of hydrogen explosions. And you don't want hydrogen explosions somewhere where we're pumping in high-level radio waste. They said, well, thank you, Walter, very much for letting us know that. The next day he came into work. You have a new office. It's down in the basement where the printers are. No telephone, and you no longer are working on this project. He didn't really understand, and he sat there for 4 months, and it wasn't until one day when his wife called his cell phone, because again, he had no telephone in his, and said, I just heard that they can't work on the project. He said, what are you talking about? I'm in my office. And he walked out, and everybody was gone, and nobody thought to tell him that they had stopped work. So that was the final straw. He realized that the company he had been so loyal to for 30 years had abandoned him because he brought these issues out. There's a group like Tri-Valley Cares Hanford called Hanford Challenge. He went to Hanford Challenge, brought successful litigation about this, reinstated to his job, and they went back to the design, back to the original design. So it's a success story, and only one that came at personal expense to this gentleman, one that brings us just to the point whereas we should all be very aware and that these kind of situations take place. Luckily, he was a brave person and was able to stand up to this kind of isolation from a big company, but it can be a very tough thing. I have a worker right now who came down with kidney cancer in a building at Livermore Lab, and she asked to be moved, and they did move her out of her office. They moved someone else into the office. 3 months later, he left on medical leave. She doesn't know why. She was ashamed about her kidney cancer. She thought it was something, that was personal that she had done that got her to have kidney cancer. And then at a party, she was talking to another gentleman, and they were casually talking, and he mentioned he had just had his kidney removed, and they worked in the same building. 15 of them work in this machine shop. And she said, whoa, I had my kidney removed because I had kidney cancer. And he said, wow, I had kidney cancer too. That makes 5 of us. And so they are now trying to get more attention, and I'm trying to help them to get more attention to the fact that people are working in a site that is giving them kidney problems or kidney cancer. Another person in there has pancreatic cancer, but same systems. So I bring these up, especially her case. She still works at the lab, all those people do, because this is an ongoing thing. There's kind of an idea in the Department of Energy that there's legacy contamination and there's people used to get sick, but now we've taken care of those problems and people no longer get sick, and that's really not true. These people are still getting sick, and maybe it is because of legacy contamination, but they're still actively working with toxic chemicals and radioactive materials, and people can still get sick from those things. One positive thing is that there is an act called the National Defense Authorization Act. Horrible act.
Ooh.
Does terrible things. Terrible things. There happens to be one provision in NDAA that is remarkably good for whistleblowers. It says that people who work at contractors for the federal government are eligible to bring whistleblower actions as a federal employee, rather than being tied to just being a private employee. So it's made it a lot easier for whistleblowers at places like Department of Energy, National Nuclear Security Administration, sites like Livermore that are managed by private contractors to bring a whistleblower action as a federal employee. It's just a better act. The Federal Employees Whistleblower Protection Act is a better act than what you would get as a private employee. It's not great, but it's better. There's lots of other acts, environmental laws mainly, that provide for whistleblower protections, but still generally they have a short statute of limitations. They require that you have been retaliated against in some way, and that can be really hard to prove. For example, Walter, the man in Hanford, he was just isolated. They didn't fire him. They just tried to make him leave. And that can be pretty difficult to show that in court as retaliation. That putting him in a room by himself was really them retaliating. He was able to do it. The court felt that his isolation was retaliation. But a lot of workers kind of throw up their hands and say, well, I tried to blow the whistle. I brought a safety and health issue to the attention of the powers that be in the facility, and nothing was done. And they didn't do anything to me either. They didn't fire me, they didn't move me, and truthfully, then you don't have a legitimate whistleblower claim. You have to have been retaliated against under these laws. So that can be a hard burden of proof and be a deterrent to blowing the whistle. They have the option when there's an organization like Tri-Valley Cares to relay the information to us, and then we can independently try to go and do something, which is kind of why organizations like ours that are in the community are important. But we don't exist in all communities. I've told most of the stories I wanted to tell, and I'm happy to take some questions, but before I do, I just thought I'd mention something that's slightly off topic, but that Tri-Valley Cares is working on, and that does relate to an extent, and that is that the lab failed security drills repeatedly in between 2005 and 2010. It was shown that they could not make nuclear materials safe on a site that was only 1 square mile with houses right up to the gate, that's packed with 600 buildings, and the security just wasn't able to keep mock terrorists from being able to obtain special nuclear material for long enough to detonate a dirty weapon. And they even knew what day these mock terrorists were coming to try to do these drills. So the Department of Energy made the decision that the largest quantities of nuclear material should be removed from Livermore, and this was at Tri-Valley Cares. We worked really hard to push them to make this decision, and we won it, and in 2012 they moved all bomb-usable quantities of special nuclear material off-site. They moved it to sites where they have better security. I mean, we were hoping they would take it out of the programmatic work, and they did with some of it, but most of it ended up going back to Los Alamos. Some went to WIP, which is a waste treatment facility in New Mexico. But it can truthfully be made safer at those sites. Los Alamos is 45 square miles, not 1. It's easier to make safe there. So we saw it as a victory. It also hampers the ability of scientists at Livermore Lab to do nuclear weapons research, and that's a good thing. We'd like to move Livermore Lab out of nuclear weapons, shrink the complex, not spend as much money, not have all these brilliant people working on these things, shift them to things that are more important priorities. But now, even though we had this victory, now at the bequest of scientists at the lab, under one program, they're trying to bring back plutonium bomb cores from Los Alamos, the same plutonium that we got removed, up to 6 times a year. They want to take bomb cores and ship them on trucks to Livermore, do environmental testing on them, which means shaking them, baking them, and dropping them in a drop test. This would all be to test a use environment on modified nuclear weapons, and then ship those plutonium pits back to Los Alamos. And they've urged us that when they do this, they will somehow wave a magic wand over Livermore Lab, and it will have adequate security while those cores are there, and then they'll bring them back to Los Alamos. Then there's going to be minimal impacts, minimal dangers to health, and we should.
I don't know if that was the first article of this kind. I think it was.
I haven't heard of this issue going back that long, so that's interesting. I think people think it's more of a contemporary post 9/11 issue, but it's really not. And you might know too that some Plowshares protesters, including an 82-year-old nun, were able to cut the fence and get on site at the Y12 nuclear facility in Tennessee. And they made it all the way into the high secure area one night and were able to be there for like 45 minutes before security got to them. The point of that demonstration or that action was to bring attention to nuclear weapons work, and I think that's what they were thinking about. The effect of that has actually been amazing and really different. The Department of Energy has had to Congress was very upset. Lots of people are very upset that this happened, and they've had to go back and do major reevaluation of some of their programmatic work that they're doing and what their current security requirements are. And it's really shown that it's very difficult to make this material safe anywhere, and they have no answers for how they can do that. And it really brings up questions about, can we do this safely anywhere? No. I'll move on. Yeah.
No, I just wanted, you stated a figure, $250,000 for compensation?
Sure, yes.
That's all?
Yes.
What if you have liver cancer?
What if you died?
Yeah. And that's all the money that...
That's much higher than the average compensation for ordinary workers.
Well, isn't that tied to the tort reforms? And then
Well, let's do it by people have questions. Okay.
I mean, yes, it is a low amount. It's tied to what they thought the average would be if you were to bring a private action around the country for these kind of worker contaminations. But it's tied to what that number was in 2000. They haven't changed it since then. At this point, workers are happy to get anything. One of the difficulties with the act, and one of the reasons why they created it, is because it used to be that your own worker files were classified. So if you brought private action, you still could not get a hold of those. So how could you, prove worker contamination without your files, without Department of Energy materials? So now that can happen in a classified setting at Department of Labor. I still don't get to see them when I represent people, but the Department of Labor does. We have to trust them that they're, accurately reading those materials and doing the claimant's claim justice, but it's not always, possible. Yes, sir. I'll go through it.
That the labs are privatized.
Yes.
Do the workers actually work for a private company now? And if so, if that's what's going on, it's just like any other corporation where they cut corners.
Yes.
So would you explain that?
Sure.
Do they work one of these 5 companies? Or?
Yeah, it used to be that if you worked at Livermore Lab, your check came from University of California, and now your check comes from Lawrence Livermore National Security, LLC. They work for a private company. What's really alarming about this situation is that management, quote unquote management of the LLC, so they just manage the contract, basically, is what they do. Since under the new contract, post University of California, salaries have gone up about 4 times. The new director of the lab now makes almost $500,000 a year. He used to make 1/5 of that. Their costs have skyrocketed. They've moved themselves out of the facility and into town because they don't even want to be on site. They want to have separation between the workers and management. And they come out with something called their performance evaluation review every year. I'll just give you this example because it came out just last week. We've had to get it from the Freedom of Information Act. They failed. So they self-evaluate, and in their self-evaluation, they gave themselves excellence across the board. Well, when NNSA, the government, came in and did its own audit, they failed. They got a 78%, and according to this, that's a failure, which should mean that the contract comes up for review and that it can be bid out by other companies, that there should be in-depth looking at this contract and at what the management company is doing. But the head of NNSA, who was, I'll get to that point last. The head of NNSA, whose name is Neil Miller, she used her own authority to increase the score high enough so that they just automatically got their contract. They also got another $500,000 for a total of almost $50 million in bonuses.
This is just for the management.
Just for management. And they do this process at all of the labs. Los Alamos' situation was even worse. They had 68% and also ended up passing because she just gave them the check mark, gave them millions more in compensation. And she, 2 weeks later, was promoted for probably these actions and others. We are trying to get press for it, and it will. Yes?
How is Tri-Valley funded?
We are funded by a mixture. About 40% of our funding comes from foundation funding, the largest being a foundation located here in San Francisco called Plowshares Foundation or Plowshares Fund. Then we are about another 50% of our money comes from individual donors. We have about 5,600 members, but to be a member, you do not have to donate. However, many of our members do donate, once a year or so, sometimes twice, and we have a few larger donors. And then about 10% of our funding is from the Environmental Protection Agency because we get something called a TAG grant or Technical Assistance Grant. So we monitor and engage the community in the cleanup process that's happening at the main site. And at Site 300, Livermore has a high explosives testing range that's in the hills beyond town. That's a large facility where they do just what it sounds like. They test high explosives. So they blow stuff up out there. There's tons of depleted uranium that they've blown up out there, and it's very contaminated. And so we get to go to those sites and get to give feedback on how they're cleaning it up, what schedule they're doing it, what the standard they're doing it to is, and we make sure that community kind of gives its approval for that. So that's where our funding comes from. Yes?
One quick question, is this where the depleted uranium is near the Lawrence Livermore lab here, or the one down in Livermore, California?
There's the main site that's in town in Livermore, and then the site where there's depleted uranium is between Livermore and Tracy in the foothills in a more remote area, although Tracy is rapidly growing right to it. But yeah.
All right, the second part is, in terms of causality, do these corporations ever openly officially acknowledge that the work caused this, or is it always like a settlement saying it's not our fault, but we'll pay you so much money?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. The causation is a independent doctor reviews the records that show what your contamination was at the facility and decides whether it was 50% or more likely that your illness was caused by those exposures. And they give you a percentage. So if your percentage was 44%, and they acknowledge in a letter to you all the things that they think you were exposed to. They'll say beryllium and uranium and toxic metals, potentially plutonium and asbestos, and I mean the list goes on and on for the things they have there. But we don't think that caused your liver cancer because you only work there for 5 years or for whatever reason. They don't even give a reason. But so then you don't really get acknowledgement that even though you know you were exposed, you don't know that they don't agree that your cancer was caused by that.
One of the things that's
If
in,
it was 54%, then what would they say?
Then they'd say, yes, you get compensation. Your illness was likely caused by your exposures.
One of the things that's very important to understand is that the nuclear workers in Japan, many of them are contract workers. So they're not even keeping a proper registry of where these workers work, and they work in different plants all over the country. And also, when they do apply for compensation from working at the plants, they only provide compensation for cancer. However, there are many other diseases that are caused by radiation. Those are not compensable. So you can get these other diseases, and you can't get compensation. But if it's cancer, and you can prove it. But the main problem is thousands of workers, contract workers, part-time workers, day laborers in Japan are, because they don't keep proper registration, they can't even prove that they've been injured and sickened by working in these facilities. And as was reported earlier, the Yakuza hire these day laborers in Japan, and they don't tell them anything. In some cases, they have lead over their dosimeters. So they're covering up the contamination of these workers who.
I just want to mention too that there's actually a demonstration nuclear reactor in Pleasanton, California, which is really near Livermore. It's called GE Valicitas. It is still operational, or at least one cell is. And many workers worked at GE Valicitas and at Livermore Lab and have exposures from both places. Sometimes their exposures at GE Valicitas were even worse than they were at Livermore Lab.